JD, it's been 5 years since I went to the AAS conference, but flew to Vegas this week, and it was in a casino. Now, you were there longer than I. How'd it go?
Well, I thought it was great, David. I mean, you said that you hadn't been there in a while, and neither had a lot of folks. In fact, AAS had lost its way for a little while, and it's the American Association of Suicidology, which is about research and researchers hadn't been there for a few years because it had lost its way. This year, they're back, and I think AAS is back too, David.
Well, let's push it all on black. Let it ride, John. Let's get this show going.
Welcome aboard Lifelines with David and John, your guide to charting the transformative course of crisis intervention and the game-changing 988 Lifeline.
Well, welcome back to Lifelines, the 988 podcast with David and John, where every call brings a new beginning. We're coming at you from the heart of Atlanta, Georgia, but stretching out usually across the nation today, across the planet, across the pond. We're diving deep every week into the pulse of crisis intervention, suicide prevention, exploring the rich history and the promising future of 988. We're your hosts. If this is crisis is your thing, then you're in the right place. Dr. John Draper is with me. I'm David Covington, and we were crisis way back before it was cool. Today, you can see us on YouTube. Please like and subscribe and listen wherever you follow your podcasts. We're brought to you by Behavioral Health Link. And today, John, episode 7 is going to be really great. Brooklyn, tell us about our amazing guest and the story for today.
Yeah, I am so thrilled to be welcoming today a friend and colleague, Dr. Thomas Niederkrotenthaler, who's a suicidologist and mental health researcher on media effects on suicide. He's also the associated professor of public health medical university in Vienna, Austria, founding chairman of the Werner Weichstraten for suicide research. So welcome, Thomas. So great to have you here.
Oh, thanks so much, John. And thanks, David and John, for the invitation to speak with you in the 988 podcast. It's really exciting. Thank you.
We're glad you're here. And we're brought today by Behavioral Health Link. John, tell us a little bit about our sponsor.
Well, today we are going to hear from Dr. Thomas Niederkrotenthaler, David, and he's going to talk to us about ways to communicate publicly that can reduce suicide. And in crisis care systems, communications, private and secure ones, are also critical to saving lives. BHL's platform assures that private air traffic control-like communications are reliably and securely transmitted across all systems encountering a person in crisis, and then integrating a person's care from the call center to any mobile crisis, follow-up, outpatient, and inpatient care needs that they may have. The platform consolidates a continuous case record so the individual doesn't have to repeat their story over and over to every person who helps them, and each professional has a clear picture of that individual's personalized care needs. BHL can be your system's communications partner in developing top-quality coordinated care. Visit behavioralhealthlink.com to learn a little bit more. David?
So our guest today, Thomas Niederkrotenthaler. Thomas, tell us a little bit about yourself, something a little bit more than the professional bio that John just shared.
Well, sure. Glad to do that. Yes. Well, in terms of suicide research, you've mentioned the most important things. So we are doing really the research on the media effect side. So what's really the effects of different stories? And actually also in my private life, I'm really interested in personal stories of people because I was always fascinated already as a child that personal storytelling that has a power which it's not similar to any other type of books. So whenever I really liked reading books and also watching movies, but it was always the sort of movies which really go with your heart and which inspire you to think different about the world. But thinking about the world really always means also to think about yourself. So that's really a great source of power. And I think it's just really a logical thing now to find it also in our suicide related research on what the impacts of different kinds of suicide stories are. So I think that's a fascinating thing. And the other thing, if I speak about my personal life, of course, I like doing other things which are also positive for mental health, like, for example, hiking. Now, I'm based in Austria. Austria is known for the Alps, for high mountains. So, yeah, so I like climbing those mountains too, and so there's a lot you can do here. And I'm really, now it's getting spring and summer, so there will be some time to do that as well.
Storytelling, Thomas. This is where John and I live, and we can't wait to get into this with you. But one of the first things we do in the show is we take a guess, and I've got my blank piece of paper and my marker. I'm just going to write on here what I believe you're a super fan of, Thomas. So you like hiking, but super fan it can be music or art, or I'm a Dallas Cowboys fan, have been since I was a young kid. John, what are you a super fan of?
Oh, I mean, I just love all kinds of music. I'm a music fanatic.
So we're going to take a guess, and I don't know you. John's met you in person, and so we're going to have to, John, let's take a shot at this. Let's see what we think John is, Thomas is a super fan of. Okay, I've got mine. John, you ready?
Yep.
Okay, so on the count of three.
Yep.
It's cliched. You said opera. I said classical music, Beethoven.
Movies and all the things that didn't say opera. Papageno Effect came from an opera.
Okay, so Thomas, are either one of us in the ballpark?
Right. You see, you can't read it. I'm sorry for that. But it's saying Mozart. Yeah. So it's
I was going to say Mozart.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Who's closer here, John? I got Beethoven and you got opera. Maybe you're closer. It's a tie. I don't know.
Yeah. We're in the ballpark for sure.
Right.
Okay. So
in the auditorium anyway. Yeah.
So Thomas, our first segment is the over-under. It's a trivia question. So I'll ask a question. John Draper's going to come up with a number, and then you take the over or the under. He's either too high or too low. So we're going to show a picture that there's actually, of course, not an actual photograph, but this is a simulation of what Rosa Parks looked like when she refused to move to the back of that bus. Now, we're going to talk a lot about the influence of stories, of words. We talk about, we've heard the concept of contagion effect. And we've heard that a lot recently, from Ebola to COVID. But in you made a statement in your TED Talk that we were watching about hope being contagious. Well, courage also, I think, is contagious. John Draper, how many individuals over the course of the 1960s gained the courage from watching what Rosa Parks did, that they themselves engaged in a nonviolent act of civil disobedience in the participation of the civil rights movement? Now, our answer is going to be given to us by ChatGPT, because I posed that question to ChatGPT. It gave me a lot of good feedback, and then it said, it's hard to estimate that, and I forced it to estimate. So how many individuals during the 1960s saw what Rosa Parks had done, gained the courage to do something similar themselves? Over under, John.
Thomas, if you know more about American civil rights as an Austrian than I do as an American, I'm going to be very embarrassed. But I mean, this is a wild guess. And David, we're including people. These are all people who specifically said, Rosa sent me. Is that essentially?
Well, not necessarily, but it's hard to pull if someone handcuffed themselves to a counter in a restaurant in Memphis. It's hard to say they weren't influenced by Rosa Parks. So I said, ChatGPT, give me everybody, and we're giving Rosa credit
all acts of
because she led the way.
Yeah. Okay. This is going to be a wild guess, but I'm going to say 2 million.
2 million. Okay. Thomas Niederkrotenthaler, higher or lower than 2 million?
That's really a hard one. I mean, 2 million is a really high number.
Yeah.
I think it's still maybe more than 2 million. can I add why I think it's more?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because I think ChatGPT still doesn't know all of all of the cases. Yeah.
ChatGPT knows what we've told it. That's what it knows. So look, let me, who knows? I don't know the answer, and I couldn't force ChatGPT into giving me a number. So John, I appreciate you playing the game. Here's what ChatGPT said. Estimating the number who participated in acts of nonviolent civil disobedience during the civil rights movement. That's hard, but let's look at the hundreds of people who participated in the freedom rides. There were thousands of students who participated in sit-ins in multiple cities. They went to segregated lunch counters and other public places. 250,000 people attended one of the largest demonstrations in U.S. history at the time with the March on Washington in 1963. Thousands of marchers over several attempts went from Selma to Montgomery in 1965, culminating in a successful march with protection from federal troops. And others localized protests and boycotts regularly and involving. So ChatGPT, when I pushed it, it said it's reasonable to estimate that tens of thousands to potentially hundreds of thousands of individuals participated. I'm going to say, Thomas, John's had a rough,
2 million to me, David.
John's had a rough stretch. So I'm going to say that John called it spot on.
Yeah, right.
It was exactly 2 million. And John, you win today. And Thomas, he hedged, right? So
yeah, Thomas, you didn't really give a fair answer. It was, you said, maybe I think it's less, it's a lot, but no, I think it's more. So
Thomas, the bottom line is that behavior and the story, very few people actually witnessed this firsthand. And the picture I created came from a simulation. So the story of what she did impacted hundreds of thousands or even 2 million people. Thomas, tell us a little bit about how this looks in the suicide prevention realm, and specifically tell us what is the Werther, or I don't know how you pronounce it in German, and the Papageno. What do those mean?
Thanks for that. And just let me extend that example a bit. If we ask ChatGPT, maybe we should do that in the next run. We should ask ChatGPT how many people cope with their crisis and how many of them are reported in the media. At least for the last question, you will find a relatively small number. And if you then think about how many people in the communities, in families are out there who have coped with crisis situations, who manage their suicidal feelings, their suicidal thoughts, who have lost someone to suicide and managed to cope, it's a huge number. So we always have this discrepancy between how many portrayals do we have of coping with loss to suicide, coping with suicidal thoughts, and how many reports do we on the other hand have about the tragedy of suicide. And actually your question about the Werther effect is exactly the question, what's the impact of a media story reporting on the tragedy of a suicidal act? Like a story that is focusing on a suicide death, on the way the death occurred, on the suicide method. And there we see that there is an increase in suicide subsequently. Now, this has been known for a very long time. The research goes back until the 1960s. It was actually a US sociologist who found that for the first time. It was David Phillips who found that after the reporting of suicide on the title page of the New York Times, there was an increase in suicide subsequently, and he called this the Werther effect. And then the other thing is not only suicide and the tragedy, which is a real tragedy behind suicide, it is contagious. It's also hope and recovery, which is also real, and that can also be contagious. And this is just the research on this has a much younger history. It was back in 2010 when we got out the first study where we found it was rather a coincidence. We found that after the featuring of stories of people who managed to cope with their suicidal thoughts and feelings, there was a small decrease in suicide subsequently. And now you might wonder, why do we call it Papageno effect? Well, it's because of Mozart's opera, because, I mean, the Magic Flute, it's the most well-known opera in the world. And Papageno, he becomes suicidal at one point of the opera because he just fears he doesn't get his love, Papagena. And he prepares everything for his suicide, but then at the last second, there are 3 boys entering the stage and they are shouting, well, Papageno, don't do it. Remember, you just have one life. Use your magic bells, whatever that means, and she will come back. And actually, that's what Papageno does. And what we felt, obviously, no one has magic bells, but everyone has some different options. And if you're suicidal, you might not remember what other options you have because the situation is just so overwhelming and so difficult. And what we felt that the best thing a media story could do was really to remind the audience of what else they can do instead of dying by suicide or making a suicide attempt. And that's why we call it Papageno Effect. And since then, we have conducted a lot of studies, including randomized controlled trials, which are actually experiments to test the effect of different stories. And we found many times that there is this beneficial effect of stories of hope and recovery.
And my understanding is actually it wasn't just a beneficial effect, that it was associated with reduction of suicides, that when people were exposed to these stories of people coping through suicidal thoughts. Is that right?
Right. I mean, that we have found as well. There's the study on hip-hop artist Logic and his song 1-800-273-8255, featuring the former number of the Lifeline. And this was really, it was huge in the media. So there was a lot of exposure, people listening to the song. It was in the top 3 of the US Hot 100 for several weeks. Number one?
Yes, wow. Number 1, ahead of Taylor Swift.
That's really great.
Yeah.
And yeah, so Logic featured this with suicide attempt survivors at the MTV Music Awards, at the Grammy Awards again. It was just an exposure you never have for a story of hope and recovery. And that's really what the essence is of this song. It's a story of hope and recovery. And there we found there was nearly 10,000 additional calls to the Lifeline. So about 7% more than expected in the month of greatest exposure to the song. And at the same time, there was a reduction of suicides of about 245 fewer suicides than expected. So, which is really a very promising and encouraging finding, because it suggests that these kinds of portrayals of hope and recovery, they can really do something, and they can really help people to cope with their adversities, to do something else than making a suicide attempt or dying by suicide.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. I knew this would come up about the Logic song and the video too, which was also hugely popular and now has, I think, over 440 million views, Thomas. But as you said, it's a story in which a person calls the line who's saying, I want to die. And then by the end of the call says, I want to live. And it is truly a Papageno Effect sort of song. And you, when you did the study, you noted that that calls to the Lifeline increased, and you attributed the reduction in suicides that occurred during these periods as probably likely due to the calls. And as much as I'd love to say it's the calls, and maybe it is, I don't know if we can share. This is a photo of some comments on YouTube of people who listened to the song, who saw the video, and the comments here are pure Papageno. I don't know if we can get that on the screen here, if that's something we can share. If not, then we can just share it later. But it's stunning, Thomas. And you mentioned too. Well, can you tell me a little bit? What do you think? Do you think that reduction in suicides could also be attributed to people just hearing the lyrics of the song that might not have heard the song before?
That's a very, very interesting question. The straightforward answer is we really don't know what the mechanism really is. So have they all got help from the Lifeline? Have they just waited for some time and then something else happened? Did they do something entirely different, like finding some other way to get more hope? And was the song more a trigger to get a bit more hope, to wait a bit longer, to act out suicidal feelings? That's something we just don't know at this point. I think it's a very reasonable thing to think about it in different ways. Like some people, and we have seen that it was a tremendous increase in calls associated with the song. So it makes a lot of sense that some of those who were in distress got help, and that was part of the equation here and of the reduction in suicides. But at the same time, it's I think it's very reasonable that things like entertainment, films or movies, or in this case, it's a hip hop song, they remind us of different things we can do, and they help us open up a bit our mental sphere in some way. And what really helps people, there can be really different things. I think it can be quite a different set of things that people did subsequently. But I think it's so important what you said initially, John, that you found the comments about the song and they were all Papageno-like. And I think this is something that is not unique to this song. It's really happening all the time. If you have a story only focused on despair, it must not even be despair from suicide. It can be something else. Then you will have a lot of comments also focusing on despair.
Yeah, it's rare that you hear somebody say a piece of art saved my life, and that is what you see in those comments.
And, John, let's keep going, John. And I think the discussion of movie and film is a good one to get us into the good news. The good news section, we're going to talk about a film that we created, Thomas, to focus on the stories of people who've lived. So you were referencing in the United States, we think there are 10 to 15 million people a year who seriously contemplate their own death. They're in a lot of pain. Most of them forge some way forward. Some of them find some post-traumatic growth out of that, but they don't tend to be the stories that we tell in our broader culture and the news. We tell the stories of people who've died, of maybe famous people who've died. So we made a film, Moving America's Soul on Suicide, that is 6 stories of people who all made suicide attempts, but found some way forward. And we focus on their whole life and the strengths of that individual. So one of the things we did, John, was we looked at 15 national and international mental health organizations, from SAMHSA to the International Association of Suicide Prevention, and we looked at their YouTube channels. They all have YouTube channels, and for the last almost 20 years, they have collectively posted 6,000 videos. One of the things we wanted to do was make this film as accessible as possible, and you'll see in this picture of Silouan and his family that we published it to YouTube to make it available to everyone around the world. And we've looked at where does it stand in those 6,000 videos. We published it on February the 2nd, and in 3 months, it's already number 3 out of those 6,000 videos in terms of views, has 7,700 thumbs ups. Thomas, you can thumbs up it if you like. It's easy. You just push that little button on there. But we've got we're number 3 in comments. There's another video from the American Association of Suicidology, John, who's also the story of a suicide attempt survivor that has about 250 comments at this point. And then in terms of engagement, we're number 1 out of those 6,000 videos already of people doing something with that story that we've told. So, John, your reflections on, again, 2 months in, our goal is to reach 1 million people in the first year. When Kevin Hines' Ripple Effect came out in 2018, he had 500,000 viewers in that first year. Because we're on YouTube, our ability to get this out there should be greater. So reflections on the good news of the day, John.
Well, I think it's fantastic. It doesn't surprise me. I've seen the stories. I've seen the movie. I know these people, and they're all impressive beyond words. And it's incredibly moving. And it does remind me, Thomas, when we look at movies like this, and I know you've seen a number of these movies, and you mentioned movies, television, Have you done any research that has shown the type of media messaging vehicle is like certain types are better? For example, movies, TV shows, as opposed to celebrity interviews in print? Or do we have a sense as to what vehicles for getting the message out or have the strongest Papageno effects?
There's some research on that, but it's still not a definitive answer to that. It also depends a bit on the different country where you look at the data, because in some countries people are reading a lot of newspapers. Mm-hmm. For example, in my country, people are reading still the largest penetration of any type of media in terms of information sharing is newspapers in my country. So, it's very, very different from North America. For example,
what's a newspaper?
Right, exactly. Right. So that's really important to look at the cultural differences also, but we see that anything that really reaches a large audience, that's really important. So, and of course, entertainment media, movies, they typically reach larger audiences than written textbooks, for example. But it's also true that we have found the effect for different sorts of media. So it's not necessarily restricted to one type of media. And then there's maybe one thing to add, that is, if it comes to the Papageno stories, so stories of hope and recovery, then typically some of the most traditional media types relatively rarely feature those stories. They would say we don't have the space, we don't have the time for the stories, they are not considered that newsworthy compared, for example, to stories about suicide death. So it's important also to look at the online stories that are out there, because there are so many online stories about hope and recovery, and that's the perfect setting also to feature those stories and to have no restrictions for in terms of space and time.
Thomas, I was at the American Association of Suicidology conference this past week, and one of your colleagues, I believe Mark Senior, spoke. And the primary thrust of the presentation was about the different guidelines for the media, the do's and don'ts, if you will. And he went through a lot of this kind of material. But toward the end, he challenged the audience that maybe the do's and don'ts weren't the most powerful component. Maybe rather we should look at the narrative. What are you thinking? What's your thinking about that concept, and what does he mean?
I think it's extremely important, and it's exactly what our research has shown for the past few years. So in the 1960s, 70s, for example, or even 80s and 90s, people would really look at very specific components of a story, like does it feature a suicide method, yes or no? Is there some help resource given, yes or no? Is it simplifying suicide, yes or no? These are all very important, and they make up the media guidelines. But when we look at the Papageno effect and which types of stories really have that impact, it's not about one single ingredient of the story. It's really the overall focus of the story, which appears to make a huge difference. And here, it's really the difference is it the story of hope and recovery, or is it the story about the suicide death? And now, let me get that right. I think the media guidelines are extremely important. They are still very, very important, because sometimes you would have journalists saying we have to report on this specific suicide. We can't change the narrative. It's just the narrative is given. We have to do risk mitigation. So these guidelines are really important when it comes to risk mitigation in order to prevent the Werther effect. However, and there's also, I'm sure Maxinia has presented on that as well, more recent research finds that the guidelines are doing a very good job in terms of improving the quality of the reporting as outlined in the media guidelines, but they do not a good job in terms of changing the narrative. So we have found in several studies that the narrative doesn't change even if you distribute the media guidelines to media professionals. Now, why is that? Maybe part of the reason is because it's just very much in our culture ingrained if we speak about suicide prevention, we would speak about suicide death first, and then add a bit about prevention, maybe. I think that's very much ingrained in our cultures, no matter where you look at the picture. And therefore, those stories of hope and recovery, they're still something new in the news media. And therefore, if we try to promote stories of hope and recovery or campaigns, we don't do risk mitigation primarily. We actually need a different set of advice, like how to do a media campaign for suicide prevention. This then goes directly into the question of how to do strong storytelling about hope and recovery, lived experience, etc.
This is a major, major advance in terms of focusing on the narrative, because I want to take you back to 2007, Thomas, before your research came out, and we were doing stories of hope and recovery for the Lifeline. And a number of very distinguished colleagues of mine were discouraging me and us from doing it. And what they were concerned about was that they were mentioning suicide methods in there, and that we were perhaps glorifying suicide prevention, and that, or suicide over suicide, the suicide attempts, I should say, that we were glorifying that in some way. And so they thought maybe this would cause a copycat of suicide attempts. And so I remember Thomas Joyner saying, look, guys, there's no research that says that a person who's talking about suicide methods in a story, in a narrative, which the underlying theme is they're better. And they're better for it. They're better now because they've gotten through it, and they can have lessons learned for all of us. That nothing says that people pick out that suicide method and then say, I'm going to try that too. And I think this is a good example, this narrative notion of that it's really about the larger story. We can't be just picking out little pieces of it.
No, totally agree. And we still have to do more research to see how much you could raise the topic of a suicide method within a narrative of hope and recovery. Now, we don't know the answer for that right now, so we still advise not to focus on a suicide method. What I sometimes do, if I want to know if it's too much focused on a suicide method, I ask people to summarize the content with one sentence or two. And if they mention a suicide method within this one sentence, then I know it's probably too strong. Because we have one important thing here. Sometimes the suicide method is used as a turning point in the story, and then it's created as a very strong point also. And so it's really important to reflect on which types of one story to really highlight and which other parts which are also real of the story, not to highlight them so much for the public discussion about the story. So that's really important, and it's really something that we are now finding out. I'm now having a project where we really want to present 3 different kinds of short films. One of them focusing on hope and recovery without mentioning a method. The second one, the same story, but mentioning a method. And the third one is not a story of hope and recovery as a control group.
Ooh, interesting.
So we really want to find that piece. And it's very important also, people doing the storytelling tell us that they know the media guidelines and they use them, and they really want to do good with their stories, so they use them. But some of them also say that they would feel it's more authentic to let people know about the method. So it's really important for us to find this out.
So, Thomas, it's the challenge is finding that sweet spot of there's enough focus on the pain that it doesn't feel like what some people have called hope propaganda. It's not too simplistic, but it doesn't glorify. We did a video with a guy named Chris Bartz and telling about his journey. And there were a couple of elements that we excerpted because it just felt like it was too triggering. And he came back and found he resisted strongly with us that we reinsert that component, because at the end of the day, he said, you see in this video my life fall apart if you don't know what happened to me, you don't know why it fell apart. So it's this balance. So Thomas, let's do an interactive little segment here. And look, yeah, I know you're a scientist and it's about the data, but we're going to encourage you in this segment to give us this is more helpful or more harmful? More helpful or more harmful based on what you know about them? Let's start with some easy ones and then we'll get into a little bit more. 13 reasons why, Thomas. That was more helpful or more harmful? Give us a quick one on your thoughts on 13 reasons why. That's a thumbs down for the audience. That's not helpful.
But a thumbs down. Give a quick notion. Tell us why.
Well, it's really the narrative. It's again the narrative. It's not the narrative of hope and recovery. It's really the opposite, because Hannah Baker, the main character in the show, she wants to get help. She really tries to get help, but her help seeking is portrayed as futile and even counterproductive. So actually, it's portrayed as if the help seeking was actually the reason why she needs to die by suicide. So that's a very dangerous message for young people who are in a crisis situation. And then there are other things with the story, but that's maybe the most important aspect.
So Thomas, very fatalistic sort of message. Here's another one. Logic's rap song, more up or down? Okay, we've talked about that one. John, you were there at the Grammys, John. Now, what an experience that was for you to see that hit its zenith.
It was moving to see, because everyone on stage had either been a loss survivor or an attempt survivor or a promoter of suicide prevention. So it was a very meaningful moment for all of us.
More helpful or more harmful? The Shawshank Redemption, Thomas. It has 4 suicides in it and some very graphic content. More harmful or more helpful?
You know, can I take this one? And what
you
I
can't,
mean here, I can't.
Because your colleague Mark Senior wrote an article about this. So look, it's your thumb, Thomas. I'm gonna encourage you to pull one or the other. Either it just breaks the rules, or the overall narrative or you can. I guess what you're saying, Thomas, is this is a question science has to answer.
Well, that's always right. A question science has to answer. I think it is not associated with suicides. It does neither reduce suicides nor increase suicides. And if I have to choose, if it's rather increasing or decreasing, I will put it down.
Okay. What about Kevin Hines, The Ripple Effect?
I think overall it's a thumbs up. Definitely there is one part of the story which might be problematic in my opinion if it's the only part seen. It's a very strong moment in the story, the moment of the suicide attempt. But there's so much else to that story and the overall framing of the story, and I would never summarize this with the suicide attempt, this story. So definitely thumbs up.
You know, Thomas, the one thing that I will, and look, you're talking about the impact on the public. There is a stigma of shame and that these things happen to weaker, more vulnerable people. What Kevin Hines' story did for me as a clinician myself, having had training, was it obliterated the ideas I had been taught, that people who attempt suicide are completely different than people who die of suicide, because Kevin should have died of suicide, and the film conveys that fully. So sometimes I think we have, again, it's complex and it's nuanced. Let me give 2 more. Dead Poets Society. Thumbs up. Okay. All right. And where do I go next? A Million Little Things. Did you see any of the A Million Little Things show on ABC's Disney?
Yeah, I didn't see that. I'm sorry.
John, what's your thought of A Million Little Things?
It's extraordinary, Thomas. It's Papageno all the way.
Oh, yeah, great. Must see
so,
that.
Thomas, let's go another direction now. And you leaned into this, and I want to get your thoughts on this. So for me, my views of suicide and suicide prevention have been transformed not by researchers or clinicians or the media or movies, but by the real lives of people with lived experience. It's just been the movement over the last 20 years of people telling their stories. What is your thinking on the co-design or co-production of these messages? How does that play in, Thomas? What's your thought?
Well, that's the main ingredient of the Papageno effect. It can't be done without the co-design. It's not an add-on and nice to have. It's essential. It can't be done because it is the stories of people, and it is the narrative of people, their own narrative. It's what the Papageno effect actually is. And if we look at fictional things like the Logic song, then it's a fictional personal story, but it's still a personal story. And so there's no doubt that the co-design is just the main ingredient of the story. I think it's good if it's some co-design in terms of also having that exchange with academic experts and science, because then this is really to make sure that we know which kind of components are most helpful to larger audiences, like the question we raised about the suicide method within the narrative. That makes it so important to have this collaboration, but per se, it's really co-designed with academic experts, and the main part of it is really the personal experience. It's not the academic experience, it's the personal expertise, which is the main ingredient. You know, in the Logic song, I think, was there anyone involved from the academic experts? I'm not sure about it. Probably not, right?
No.
Yeah, there's a scene with a firearm that I doubt very seriously anybody in our community was involved in that video. We would all say that was harmful, and yet the overall message hit a nerve.
Exactly. Yeah. And you know what, David? We looked at the video release as well. And right after the video release, there was no reduction in suicides. It was a non-significant, very small increase. But of course, the song is much more important than only the video. So there were, right.
Yeah. You know, Thomas, something else that you're very familiar with was the excitement that in Oregon that was caused. This was in the wake of the Bourdain and Spade suicides. A question that had come up among the journalists in Oregon, which was, how do we report on suicide? And so they convened in a large group that was really the kind of the brainchild of Dwight Holton from Lines for Life, a crisis center there, and got all the journalists together and then invited us to come speak about the Papageno effect. They got so excited about it that many of them said, you know what, why don't we just devote a week of suicide prevention stories and see what happens. And so it was, I don't remember how many stories, maybe over 100 that came out that week. Can you talk about what did we learn from that? Because you researched that. What was the impact of that and what's the takeaway?
Yeah, right. So that was a really important project, and it was just really great to see that journalists are really engaging with this topic, making something out of it. And as you said, it was more than 100 stories coming out of this project. And what we looked first was we looked at which kinds of stories came out of that engagement project, and we found that these stories were really much better than typical stories on suicide. So what do I mean here? They had more help resources. They were more focused on solutions, how to prevent suicide than typical stories about suicide. They were even better compared to similar stories, to other stories that are about suicide prevention, but not related to the campaign. They were better than that. So there was really some improvement here. And that's again going back to the question about the impact of media guidelines. What we also found is that the overall narrative did not change. So the stories were still typically focused on suicide death. There was rare focus on stories of hope and recovery. And I think we have a few lessons to learn here. So most importantly, we have to really understand that stories of hope and recovery, they haven't been on the media for a very, very long time. And these patterns, they are, if we just provide media guidelines and say, please make your story consistent with the media guidelines, then we have to know that these media guidelines were created to reduce the risk resulting from reporting about suicide death, Now, if it's a media campaign, like, for example, journalists or media professionals wanting to raise the topic, which is a totally different thing than reporting about a suicide death, then it makes a lot of sense also to create a separate set of recommendations on how to do that, like focusing on a story of hope, on stories of hope and recovery, for example. Now, only providing the media guidelines does not result in an overall change in the narrative. That's one of the important lessons. But overall, the work of the journalists, it was really much better. It was great. It's great to see this interest. And I think for us in suicide prevention, it is also a part of our business to provide recommendations, not only for the risk mitigation purpose of the reporting on suicide death and suicide attempts, but also for the reporting about suicide prevention.
Thomas, tell us a little bit about, so we have these events where Robin Williams tragically dies, or Anthony Bourdain, and there's a flood of information. It's on Twitter, it's in the media. But you've talked about the difference in a flood and a steady flow. Can you tell us a little bit about what that means and what's the impact?
Right. Thanks for that question, David. I think it's also very important because sometimes we have these instances where there is a suicide from a celebrity. There's a lot of reporting on that suicide. Now, you mentioned Bourdain and Kate Spade. There was a lot of reporting. Of course, Robin Williams, it was very much reporting over a very long time. And now the typical way to react to that would be, now let's put out some additional stories, maybe a story about hope and recovery in addition to all of those other stories. Now, what we found in our research, and actually it's quite a consistent pattern across the literature, whenever there is a huge quantity of suicide-related information, now not looking at the specific content, but when there's a peak in content, then you typically see an increase in suicide. So it's more related to the Werther effect and to the Papageno effect. And we had one specific study where we found this for tweets. Now, what we found in the study, it was more than 7 million tweets about suicide, basically all tweets from the United States, including the word suicide in a 3-year period. And we found that whenever there were more tweets about prevention, then there were more calls to the Lifeline and there were fewer suicides, which is a very important positive finding. But at the same time, when the overall number of tweets was highest, there was an increase in suicide. So what this tells us is really that we need a constant flow of those narratives. Narratives of hope and recovery should be anywhere all the time, but we should probably not flood the field with any kind of suicide related messages at peak times, because some people will feel overwhelmed by the sheer quantity of information. And the other thing here is, if you have a suicide by a very well-known person, then you can never reach that kind of exposure with a positive message, because it will all be buried in that bubble of speaking about that suicide death. That's just something we see all the time. If we compare, for example, how the Logic song, how much tweeting was there about the Logic song compared to the celebrity suicides we mentioned earlier, it was really a lot of tweeting about the Logic song, but still it was only a small proportion compared to those celebrity suicides.
So, Thomas, we're about out of time for this segment, but the more that we can bring, not just a more open narrative, but just love and respect. I mean, when Robin Williams passed away, the messages were they tended to be more shaming. They tended to mention the method. When Alan Rickman died, and he wasn't near as famous as Robin Williams, the messages typically looked like he tragically lost his battle with cancer. But there was such love and respect. And so more work to do, but thank you so much for the work you're doing. We have a segment here at the end as we just bring this a little bit lighter, but it does get into this issue of storytelling. A lot of famous people from Vienna. We've already referenced both Mozart and Beethoven. Sigmund Freud spent his time there. Christopher Waltz, Arnold Schwarzenegger, John. But Gustav Klimt, symbolist painter, the kiss in gold leaf. We can show the kiss in gold leaf on the screen. It is a well. Let's do this. Let's get straight to the true false questions. We're talking about storytelling today and messaging. So I'm going to give a statement, and on the count of three, I want both Thomas and John to say true or false. John, you said if Thomas got the civil rights question right and you got it wrong. Well, this one's the pressure's back on you, Thomas. So
Okay.
here we go. Question number one about the kiss. It was a first of its kind innovation in incorporating gold leaf. True or false?
True.
False. So there are many, during the medieval period, a lot of religious painting had that gold leaf in it. So we're 0 for 1, but we can turn this around. Right here it goes. Many people revered the painting as an important religious relic. One,
False.
2, 3.
I'll say false.
That one is false. And I think partially because Thomas, bring it, Thomas. You're there. The Klimt painting is probably nearby.
Yes, it is. You're right.
So, John, I gave you a little bit of the answer in the first one because there was so much religious iconography that had the gold leaf in it. Well, let's get to this. I'm gonna tease it up a little bit. The kiss was considered pornographic in its day, even though both figures are fully robed.
True.
True.
It's true. It's true. It's a different era, right? And the embrace, the kiss. Number 4. Because of the outcry, the kiss did not sell for decades after it was completed.
False.
True.
False. It sold before he finished it. Thomas is struggling here. Thomas needs to phone a friend on his. We should have done a Mozart opera thing, Thomas. Okay, one more. Actually, we'll do 2 more. The kiss is oversized. It stands, John, it would be like standing you side by side, 6 foot by 6 foot.
Yeah, it's oversized. True.
Thomas?
Yes, oversized.
It's a big painting. It is. In 2006, the kiss was worth a staggering $13.5 million. True or false?
True.
True.
Well, it's true, but also false. The painting was worth $135 million. The most expensive painting in the history of the world of a man and woman kissing with that gold. It's a spectacular painting, Thomas.
Yes,
have you seen it, Thomas?
Yes, I've seen it several times. I didn't think about those questions you might ask, but it's having a very positive energy also, really. I love it.
Positive energy
Mhm.
that outlived all of that controversy that started. And in fact, as the German troops were retreating, a lot of Klimt's artwork was destroyed. But thankfully, the kiss was not. So thanks for participating in our rapid fire there, Thomas and John. And it's time for some absolutely true tales of behavioral health link, John.
Okay, I'm ready.
So Greg Graham, beloved partner that I've been working with for 20 plus years, John, one of his most important concepts for working in crisis care, we celebrated him last week with his red phone in the middle of the crisis call center. But another thing that he frequently said was that, David, the crisis services must serve 2 Georges. What did he mean by 2 Georges, John? Do you know?
Yeah, he meant urban and rural, right?
He meant urban and rural. He meant that crisis call centers, text chat centers typically are in an urban area, but they're serving people living out where the farms are, out where the rural populations are. And I've got an actual photograph, John, of Greg lived in rural Georgia. He lives in Augusta, which is one of those, it's a metropolitan area, but it's a small one. And Greg drove 2.25 hours one way from Augusta to Atlanta. I bet he did that thousands of times as he would come back and forth.
Reading in the process, apparently.
He would come back and forth. And the picture, John, the absolutely true tale is I was on the phone with Greg as he was driving, and he told me that he looked back and there was a tractor trailer that was behind him. And he was like, it was like a little bit of a shriek. And I'm like, why does that bother you that there's a tractor trailer in the lane behind you? Because he was in that lane and he had passed that tractor trailer and had no recollection of passing the tractor trailer because he was reading a report that he had on the steering wheel as he was talking to me on the phone. So clearly, John, what he had done is he had on autopilot. His brain took him around that tractor trailer, but he didn't remember it, John.
I don't, did that really happen?
John, that absolutely happened. You were there too. You were also on the phone call saying those suicide risk assessment standards, emergency intervention protocols from the Lifeline needed to be implemented yesterday.
Yeah, so all coming back to me, Dave.
John, look, we've done some good news. We've done some absolutely true BHL tales, and we've had an amazing conversation with our guest, Thomas Niederkrotenthaler. Give us some plain truth, John.
Happy to do it, David. You know, back in 2016, America's suicide rates had again increased for the 9th straight year. And every year, when the CDC published our national suicide rates, they would contact me as the head of the Lifeline and ask me what I thought about these increases. And man, I hated those calls. The overwhelming weight of my 25 years of crisis intervention work had shown me that most people experiencing a suicidal crisis find help, hope, and healing, but the national suicide rates still kept rising. I also worried that the continued media focus on increasing suicides would actually feed the pervasive hopelessness for people in suicidal crisis. So I wondered, this harkens back to what you were talking about earlier, Thomas, how do we find a number to quantify what isn't happening? That is the number of suicides that we're actually preventing. So after the CDC reported an increase in suicide rates yet again in 2016, I looked at Samson CDC data that was showing the rate of serious suicidal ideation across all age groups. And that year, the ratio was for every one person dying by suicide, there were another 280 people who thought seriously about suicide but didn't kill themselves. More recently, the ratio has been calculated to be about 316 serious contemplators to every one suicide. Well, the estimate is not perfect, but it effectively illustrates a basic truth that the media has not been telling because we haven't been telling them. And what we should be telling them is this: the overwhelming majority of people find ways to cope through suicidal thoughts. And we know from Thomas's Papageno Effect research that telling the stories of how they cope through these dark moments can save lives. So my media interviews going forward, I used this 280 to 1 statistic to change the conversation with reporters from a focus on suicide to a focus on suicide prevention. So a year later, Logic's 1-800-273-8255 song was so pitch perfect Papageno that we might want to rename the Papageno Effect the Logic Effect. Logic intended to save lives with that song, and as we discussed earlier, he did. But 2018 brought a fierce challenge for those of us who knew what media suicide reporting could do to suicide rates. We anticipated a tsunami of suicides in the dark wake of 2 terrible tragedies. After fashion designer and mogul Kate Spade killed herself in June of 2018, my sister-in-law, Kirsten Powers, called me up. And at the time, Kirsten was a columnist for USA Today and a regular CNN analyst. And she said to me, my editor at USA Today wants me to write a column on Kate Spade. Is there really anything more to say about her suicide? And I said, yes, but not about Kate's suicide. I shared with her that for every one person who dies by suicide, there are hundreds of others in this country that think seriously about suicide who don't kill themselves. And as I said, those are often the untold stories of suicide prevention. And research suggests that, Kirsten, if you share these stories in the media, about how people positively cope through these moments, it actually can save lives. And Kirsten paused, and then she calmly stated, well, maybe I'll tell my story then. And she had never told the story to anyone before. The next day, while the media reported the suicide of Anthony Bourdain, Kirsten, a colleague of Bourdain's at CNN, shared her personal story of overcoming suicidal thoughts. Her June 9th USA Today editorial, where she discussed her suicidal experience, was the most read USA Today story of that week. CNN then asked Kirsten and I to appear together to discuss how people cope through suicidal thoughts, the Papageno Effect, and how the media can leverage these suicide prevention stories to create, as Thomas was noting earlier, a contagion of hope. Now, I must have done more than 50 media interviews in the wake of the Spade and Bourdain suicides in June of 2018, and the data point about that one suicide for every 280 persons who seriously think about it was used in every interview, and it really helped change the conversation from suicide to suicide prevention. Over the next week, we saw dozens of stories of suicide attempt survivors appear in print and broadcast media. One of my favorite examples is this remarkable article by Abigail Jones from Cosmo, which was entitled The Invisible 280. This is the suicide story that you're not hearing. Basically, every reporter prefers to tell the untold story, especially if they understand that telling such stories can help them make a difference in preventing suicides. Now, we knew from our experience with Robin Williams in 2014 that suicide rates increased substantially in the wake of celebrity suicides. We also knew that the suicide of two major celebrities within days of one another would drive suicides up, perhaps more than we'd ever seen. And sure enough, we saw about a 5% increase in the number of suicides following the reporting of the Spade and Bourdain deaths in 2018. However tragic this news was, that rate was half of the 10% suicide increase that we saw following the Robin Williams suicide 4 years earlier. Now, certainly one explanation for the higher rates following Mr. Williams' suicide could be that more people identified with this mega famous star. But when he died in 2014, our field's work with the media to establish safe and responsible reporting guidelines for suicide had barely taken hold. By 2018, the suicide reporting guidelines were much better known. The Lifeline number was in most every story about suicides. Fewer reporters were highlighting methods as to how a person killed themselves, and how promotion of Papageno stories of hope were more prevalent than ever. We couldn't completely prevent the waters from the Werther effect from flowing over the dam, but perhaps the Papageno effect kept the dam from breaking, protecting some people in despair who might have otherwise killed themselves. Folks, the suicide rates are still increasing, and we all need to do more to turn the tide. But one thing we know we can do is take in the lessons long known in the advertising and marketing industry. Firms spend billions every year on ads based on the simple premise that if we show people that we admire or relate to who are modeling a behavior or endorsing a product, many of us are going to follow their lead. The Werther effect and the Papageno effect are based on the same premise. When people are in great despair, they often scan the world around them, looking for what to do and what others are doing who might feel similarly. And when they do look for answers, we have an obligation to show them how we got through our darkest moments so they can see that their way out is actually a way through, about 280 or 316 times more often than the headlines seem to suggest. David, that's a wrap.
John, Thomas, that's some plain truth and a real lifeline. And the CNN coverage was the first time I saw just a lot of love and respect for someone who had tragically lost their battle. Thanks so much to our guest today, Professor Thomas Niederkrotenthaler, and for the amazing work he's doing. And join us next week when our guest will be Dr. Thomas Joyner. This idea of courage and its contagiousness has an impact for good or for ill because of the barriers to suicidality that Thomas talks about, and we'll get into that. Thanks for letting us pull you in to our crisis jam here today in this podcast. Join us next week when we'll continue to navigate the currents of crisis and care. Until then, remember, every call, every life, every story matters. Stay connected. stay supportive, and we'll see you on the next Lifelines.